With the session now, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Angela Parker Káiser. Welcome. Translating into movement, receiving language, dissolving form. You don't need to speak.
Thank you. Down here. What you just seen is an excerpt from the poem Transformation of Evil. Maybe I should catch my breath. It's by the Austrian expressionist poet Georg Trakl, and I'll give you some context for this. Repeatedly, the poem asks the question, what compels you to stand still, to stagnate on the threshold of the house of your forefathers? This step is decayed. So the recurring human figure neither moves toward nor away, neither begins to descend nor ascend as the legend of humankind, that's another recurring phrase, dictates in the poems. In other words, the figure never moves toward what is traditionally stable, eternal, unchanging, this long line of the forefathers. Neither does he begin to descend in, as Untergang in the poem occurs, the going under in a Nietzschean kind of sense. But ultimately in the poem's spatial direction is not hierarchical, neither is chronology existing or linearity in time. Things overlap. So instead, the poet stresses the importance of motion, of meaning in flux, meaning that is freed, that's apparent only as form dissolves. So in the dissolving of form and in dissolving form. My project comes from translation studies. So I study translation theory, and particularly translation of poetry. And my purpose is to translate between languages. Between is really the most accurate way to say this, because I want to reframe translation as translating, the progressive verb, so in the present, rather than translation as an end product, something that's fixed and unchanging, as is still the traditional way of translating. So what I'd like to demonstrate is translating rather than translation. And because of the time, I want to focus on this recurring question in the poem Transformation of Evil. What compels you to stand still, to stagnate on the decayed threshold of the house of your forefathers. This is a line that poses the question of stagnancy both literally and figuratively. The line also demonstrates a recurring theme in Chaco and an obstacle in his poems. The legend of humankind, again that's his phrase, his tendency towards stagnancy, to privilege what is relatively fixed, especially in verbal form, gives the figure the title, the One. He's repeatedly called the One. And there's only one human figure, arguably, across all of the poems, with semi-anonymous kind of names like the One, the Lonely One, the Solitary One, the Brother, and so forth. All human figures are also masculine in the poems, both by the gender of the word form and in the Platonic sense of the One as stable, unchanging, and really in the Christian appropriation of the Platonic fixed eternal idea that the eternal, the fixed, the unchanging is ultimately good, the most high, masculine of him. So this is really one of many forms of identity that Chaco's poems dissolve. His task as a poet is challenging because he employs verbal language with its relatively set number of connotations and denotations. It's a relative stagnancy in order to express motion. But he also employs a language of color. And crucially, this language is a language of color in movement. It's caused a lot of critics to say that his poetry is inaccessible, that the colors mean nothing. But so far they haven't recognized that the colors are actually moving and driving the action in the poems while the human figure stands still. So, verbal obstacles in literary translation are the same. The static nature of verbal language hinders the task of carrying over from meaning from one language to another. And the traditional idea of translation, carrying over meaning from one language to the other. Chaco's poems suggest a viable solution to this, but I want to be in between, not at the end, one end or the other. So employ the nonverbal languages of color and motion, such that the more universal intersemiotic language in this ambiguity that's really the most interesting and important part of his poems opens up to possibilities and meaning. So never fixing these ideas by defining them when they're actually ambiguous, even in word form, but continually drawing them to the present by showing them in motion. As Chaco's poems suggest, we should subvert the trends of naturalizing toward a dominant language. For example, this is what happens so much when translating into English. The dominant translation idea is that we should translate towards fluency in English so that it seems the poem was originally written in English. Rather, I think we should subvert that trend of naturalizing toward a dominant language and preserve the multiple meanings in the ambiguity. So in this way, the translation I'm looking at is not an end product that can be reproduced or represented, but a translation itself. So a translation is translating and also a translating process. Walter Benjamin advocated intersemiotic translation a long time ago. So he advocated recognizing translation as translating, a continuous process dependent upon movement and flux for meaning, a divine imperative for him to free the word from its literal bounds. And I think this is why he's overlooked a bit, because of this perceived messianic agenda. It's the divine imperative. In other words, from this divine imperative, Benjamin actually overturns the Platonic and especially the Christian appropriation of the idea of word with capital W as a static representation of the good, the highest good, the one, the fixed, the unchanging, and comprehends the evidence of the divine language only in the motion in between languages. So in the process of translating, where the language in motion takes a turn to the original source of language, what he calls pure language or the originary language. For Benjamin, this is the word, capital W, which the divine originally created. So without medium, it had no shape, no fixed verbal form. It was immediate. Spoken, it materialized. Speech materialized it. Benjamin calls this the magic and immediacy of original language. Well, the verbal language humans believe we command, we possess, and sometimes employ to name it and to an extent control other things, other beings being named, is, Benjamin argues, a diluted remnant of the originary language, this originally creative language, and is actually skewed in its fixed and current form. So it's limited by its very form and for its subsequent dependence upon identity and possession. Where object is subject to subject, often a human first person, it's bound to its immediacy. Especially dangerous, I think, is where human language is understood to be mediated by an I, a human first person that resembles and claims the authority of a hierarchical original I. A self-reflexive language like this is neither creative, that's Benjamin's term, so neither creative as in employing or drawing from this originally creative source of language to materialize the spoken, nor receptive, so overflowing from its source in silence and motion. So neither creative nor receptive. And Truckle says, in terms of receptivity, he called that dissolving in form. So Benjamin's imperative can be translated as a continuous translating, an imperative for a continuous translating, such that the meaning of the word is freed from its form. At once, it's most literal, so most creative, and most free, most receptive. Back to Truckle's poem. Though the legend of humankind encourages ascension and redemption, the solitary one, this recurring human figure in the poems, always stagnates in his pursuit of the legend. He dies and decays blackly, and that's where the color comes in. The human figure is always modified by the color black. So is his dying and decay. Meanwhile, the directional verbs in the poem and prepositions tied to the other recurring color words, especially the color blue, encourage a really different way of redemption. The term in the poems is erlösung, and transformation of evil, and that theme begins and ends the poem. It's usually translated into English as redemption, but a more literal and freed way of translating that would be solving or dissolving in form. So solving by way of dissolving, so that it's not a fixed endpoint redemption, but a dissolving of the static points into their multiple possibilities that are all implied by the poem, dissolution or dissolving. So while the human being is formed by his fixation on the word in the poems, and the color black that always modifies or delineates his stagnation, other figures recognize the language in color motion, and they call the human to motion. The other beings actually drive his motion when he's not being still, drive him from his stillness. So for example, the blackbirds in the poems call out in a nonverbal language, but this is a language related to the human by its connection with the color black. Their lament is necessary to draw him downward. His Untergang is desirable for the dissolution of boundary, though his logical thought informs him otherwise. So the power to lament, to cry out in the language of silence from silence, is to move the languages of emotion and motion to the present, such that the blackbirds might actuate the man's the man's spiritual twilight, in Tocqueville's words, his dissolving of self and boundary and identity and going under, in the in between of blueness, twilight blueness. I hope this makes sense. There's not so much to explain. Briefly, the color blue is the most amorphous, most motive and emotive and ideal color in the poems. Blue consistently describes the motion of water. So this is called, in some poems, the most valuable ancient source of language. Water and the color blue, the way it moves, is a language. It also describes flowing streams. The term Káiser, which connotes not only body of water, but holy water. It's the epitome of a bodily felt way of knowing without being bound or defined by bodily form, particularly human form. Other things that are blue are gentle animals that apparition in their blueness, so that the human figure, the solitary one, sees them or recognizes them when they break, when the color blue moves in the stream, or when the color blue ruptures from the cliffs. He sees or recognizes rather the blueness when it's in between, in rupture, just like the translating. This kind of seeing is called seeing inwardly. And Benjamin describes this as seeing inwardly, a field of pure color with no subject or object, such that the color sees and is seen. And this is knowing by apparition rather than by appearance. So by apparition rather than by visual sight. The movement of rupture, just like the process of translating, is an instant of apparition. So it's the movement, actually, that carries the work past its form, past appearance, to apparition that's not seen visually, but that unforms. So it's hopeful in that it negates appearance. It's like a negative showing. It's kind of mystical in that way. It flows and overflows, forms and unforms, and can only be seen really as the disappearance of appearance. So the night in darkness that dissolves the appearance of night rather than indissoluble night, which is a quote from the poem. So I'd like to return to the question transformation of evil poses. What compels you to stand still, to stagnate on the decayed threshold of the house of your forefathers? At one repetition of this question, leaden blackness is the answer. The color black, the color that describes the human in his eyesight, in his linear reason, to his devotion to what's unchanged, to the preservation of this line of the forefathers. And the idea of redemption by ascension is the color called indissoluble night in the poem, which ends up being equated with evil. So in the poem, evil is transformed into evil, where we might think evil is transformed into good. The transformation is just the end product. It's not actually a transforming. The color black is transformed to an indissoluble blackness. Because we read the poems in their verbal form and see or really visualize their images from this human protagonist, black colored perspective, we see what's called feminine or blue or animal or sister as other to the primary recurring black colored figure. It's only in the glimpses of darkness where the nonverbal language of color leads us to this literal and free meaning that we recognize as one as one with others. So in transformation of evil, the acts of transforming, the action or the movement is all driven by nonverbal language. In the languages of color, motion, and silence, self can recognize as non-self, as a transforming figure stripped of its delineations. Transformation would be more hopeful if it could be brought into the progressive and called transforming evil, because it's the process that's both freeing and meaning, and it's forming and unforming. The end result, the transformation, is limited to the human figure's understanding, so standing under rather than comprehension. Okay, so the night is indissoluble, unpassable. There's no going back, nor is there passing. What compels you to stand still, to stagnate on the decayed steps of the house of your forefathers?